The wind cut through the valley like a rusted blade, carrying dust and the bitter taste of sage across the burning yellow grasslands. Above, a lone eagle traced lazy circles against the pewter sky, its shadow dancing over the red rocks that jutted from the earth like ancient bones. This was Apache country once, before the treaties and the blood, before the railroad carved its iron scar across the land. Sarah Birdsong pulled her youngest sister closer, feeling the child's ribs sharp beneath the threadbare blanket. They had been walking for 3 days now, maybe 4. Time blurred when hunger gnawed at your belly and fear rode your shoulders like a carrion bird. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of canyons and mesas, Colonel Harrington's men were still searching. She could almost hear the jangle of their spurs, the cruel laughter that had echoed through their camp the night her husband died. "Sarah, I'm thirsty," whispered Mary, the second youngest at 12 summers. Her lips were cracked, bleeding at the corners. "Soon," Sarah lied, her own throat parched as the alkali flats they'd crossed at dawn. She was 23, too young to be mother to 3, too old to believe in miracles. But what choice did she have? Ruth at 16 could help some, but she'd gone quiet since they'd fled, her eyes holding shadows that worried Sarah more than the empty water gourds. Little Agnes, barely 8, stumbled again. Her moccasins were worn through, leaving bloody prints in the dust. Sarah bent to lift her. Though her own strength was nearly gone, the child weighed nothing. Bird bones and determination. "Look there," Ruth finally spoke, pointing to a line of cottonwoods in the distance. Trees meant water, perhaps. Or perhaps another disappointment in this land that promised nothing and delivered less. The sun hammered down despite the October date, the kind of heat that sucked moisture from living things and left them husks. Sarah's traditional dress, once bright with beadwork her mother had sewn, now hung in tatters. They all looked like ghosts. She thought, maybe they were. Maybe they'd died back there with the others and just didn't know it yet. 20 miles north, in a cabin tucked against a spring-fed creek, Jake Thornton sat on his porch cleaning a Winchester rifle, his hands moved by memory. The ritual of maintenance, one of the few things that still made sense. The cabin wasn't much, 2 rooms, a lean-to for the horse, walls of pine logs chinked with mud, but it was far from people, and that suited him fine. He'd built it after mustering out, after Mary and little Ben were gone. Cholera, the doctor had said, but Jake knew better. It was this land that killed them, this beautiful, brutal land that took everything soft and ground it to dust. 5 years now he'd lived alone, trading pelts at Fort Defiance twice a year, speaking to no one unless necessity demanded. The horse in the corral lifted its head, nostrils flaring. Jake's hands stilled on the rifle. Something coming, or someone. He'd learned to trust the animal's instincts more than his own. He stood slowly, favoring the left leg that still ached where the Apache arrow had found him at Canyon de Chelly. Funny how he'd come to hide in their lands, the very people he'd spent 3 years fighting. But then, he understood them better than his own kind now. They knew what it meant to lose everything. The first snowflakes began to fall as Sarah crested the last rise. Below, the cottonwoods she'd prayed for surrounded a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney like a beacon. Her legs trembled, whether from exhaustion or hope she couldn't say. "Stay behind me," she told her sisters. Though she had no weapon save the skinning knife at her belt, the cabin could mean salvation or worse trouble. White men this far from settlements were often running from something, just as she was. Agnes moaned softly, fevered now from the infected cuts on her feet. They needed help, needed it desperately. Sarah's pride warred with necessity, and necessity won. It always did when children were hungry. The snow fell harder as they approached, fat flakes that stuck to their hair and shoulders. Sarah's knock was barely audible above the wind. Jake heard it, though. He stood behind the door, rifle ready. A lifetime of caution breeding hesitation. Could be anyone. Deserters, Comancheros, lost cavalry. The knock came again, weaker. When he opened the door, rifle lowered but ready, he saw them huddled like quail in a storm. Apache women, from their dress, The oldest, barely a woman herself, stood straight despite the exhaustion written in every line of her body. Her eyes met his, dark and proud, even in desperation. For a moment, neither moved. The snow swirled between them, worlds colliding in the space of a doorframe. Jake saw his sergeant's voice, heard the orders, no aid to hostiles. But he also saw Mary's face in the fevered child, saw Ben in the hollow cheeks of the younger ones. Sarah waited. She'd learned to read white men's faces, the calculations they made. This one was scarred. Inside and out, she could see it in the way he held himself, the emptiness in his pale eyes. But there was something else too, a flicker of recognition. Not of her, but of suffering itself. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then the child in Sarah's arms whimpered, and the spell broke. "All four of you, come in," he said, the words rough as sandstone, pulled from some deep place he'd thought sealed off. He stepped aside, and they entered, bringing the storm with them. The warmth hit them like a physical thing, almost painful after the bitter cold outside. Sarah's eyes swept the room quickly, cataloging exits, weapons, threats, old habits from a life spent between two worlds that wanted her in neither. The cabin was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with a worn quilt, a table and 2 chairs, shelves holding a few dishes and supplies, a rifle rack on the wall, empty now since he held the Winchester. The fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling over split pine that filled the room with its resin scent. After days of cold camps and hidden fires, the heat felt like salvation and danger both. Jake watched them file in, snow melting from their hair and clothes to puddle on his floor. The woman, girl, really, still held herself like a warrior despite the child in her arms. The others pressed close to her, eyes wide as deer in lamplight. He could smell the fear on them, sharp beneath the scent of travel and hunger. "Set her down there," he said, gesturing to the bed. His voice came out harsher than intended, unused to speaking. Sarah hesitated. To put Agnes down meant trusting, meant vulnerability. But the child's breathing was shallow, her skin burning even through the wet clothes. Slowly, Sarah laid her sister on the bed, keeping her body between the child and the man. "Mary, Ruth," she said softly in Apache. "Stay close." Jake understood some of the words. 3 years fighting had taught him that much. He set the rifle in the corner, carefully, where he could reach it, and moved to the shelves. His movements were deliberate, unthreatening. He'd learned that from the Apache, too. "Got some jerky," he said, pulling down a leather pouch. "Hardtack. It ain't much." He set the food on the table, then retreated to the far side of the room. Let them come to it, like coaxing wild things. Sarah's stomach clenched at the sight of food, but she ignored it. "Water," she said in English, the word careful on her tongue. "Please, for the child." Jake nodded, filled a tin cup from the water bucket. When he stepped forward to hand it over, Sarah tensed. He stopped, set the cup on the floor, and backed away again. She retrieved it quickly, helped Agnes drink. The child's throat worked desperately, water dribbling down her chin. "She's fevered," Jake said. It wasn't a question. "Her feet," Sarah admitted. No point hiding what he could see for himself. Infection. Jake knew that kind of infection. Seen it plenty in the war. Men's feet rotting in their boots after long marches. Without treatment, the child would die. Maybe even with it. "Got some whiskey," he said. "For cleaning. Willow bark for the fever." Sarah's eyes narrowed. White man's medicine had killed as many of her people as white man's bullets. But what choice did she have? Apache remedies required plants she couldn't find, time she didn't have. She nodded once, sharply. While Jake gathered supplies, Mary and Ruth crept to the table. Hunger won over fear as they tore into the jerky, trying to eat slowly but failing. Sarah wanted to tell them to pace themselves. Too much too fast after starvation would bring sickness, but couldn't bring herself to deny them. Jake returned with a bottle, clean cloth, and a leather bag of bark. He set them beside the bed and stepped back again. That careful distance maintained. "You'll need to clean the wounds," he said. I'll turn away." Surprise flickered across Sarah's face. Most white men wouldn't have bothered with such courtesy for Apache women. She studied him again. This strange man who kept his distance but opened his door while she tended Agnes. Jake busied himself at the fireplace, adding wood, adjusting the damper, the sounds behind him, the child's whimpers, the splash of whiskey. Torn cloth brought back memories he'd worked hard to bury. Mary crying as the fever took her. His helplessness then, as now. "It's done," Sarah said. He turned to find her wrapping the child's feet with strips torn from her own dress. The hem was ragged now, showing more of her legs than proper. She didn't seem to care, focused entirely on her sister. "The bark," he said, moving to the fireplace. "Need to brew it, like tea." He worked quietly, aware of their eyes on him. The two older girls had stopped eating, watching his every move. He could feel their tension, coiled and ready. Smart girls. Trust came hard in this country, and usually ended badly. When the tea was ready, he poured it into another cup, set it on the floor between them. Sarah took it, sniffed carefully, then tasted it herself before helping Agnes drink. "Thank you," she said. The English word's formal, distant. Jake nodded, unsure what to say. He'd forgotten the rhythms of conversation, the give and take of human interaction. Easier to stay quiet. The wind howled outside, snow pattering against the windows like fingernails tapping. Inside, the only sounds were the fire's pop and hiss, Agnes's labored breathing, the creak of floorboards as Jake moved to his chair. He sat, trying not to stare at them. It had been so long since anyone else had been in this space. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, less like a tomb. Dangerous thoughts. Those? Sarah settled her sisters near the fire, making them a pallet from their blankets. They curled together like pups, exhaustion overcoming wariness. But Sarah remained alert, sitting where she could see both the door and Jake. "You're running from someone," he said finally. Another non-question. Sarah's chin lifted. "Yes, soldiers, among others." Her English was better than she'd first let on. He realized, protective coloration, like a quail blending with brush. "They won't find you tonight," he said. "Storm's too bad. Maybe not tomorrow either, if it keeps up. And after," he shrugged. "This ain't exactly on any map. Reason I chose it." They lapsed into silence again. Jake found himself studying her in sideways glances. Young to have such burdens, young to have such steel in her spine. Her face would be pretty if it weren't so gaunt, her hair lustrous if it weren't matted with trail dust. He caught himself and looked away. No good came from such thinking. Sarah felt his glances, filed them away with all the other things to worry about. He wasn't looking at her the way some men did, with hunger or calculation, more like puzzlement, as if she were a book in a language he couldn't quite read. She was tired, so tired, but she couldn't rest, not yet. This man had shown kindness. Yes, but kindness could turn. She'd learned that lesson young. "Why?" she asked suddenly. Jake looked up. "Why what? Why let us in? Your people and mine." She let the sentence trail off. They both knew the history written in blood across this land. Jake stared into the fire, weighing words. "My people ain't really my people anymore," he said finally. "Haven't been for some time." Sarah understood that kind of exile, to be caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. It was a loneliness sharp as any blade. "The child," she said, nodding toward Agnes. "She reminds you of someone." Jake's jaw tightened. Too perceptive by half. This one. "Maybe. I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said simply. The words held weight, coming from one who knew such losses intimately. Jake looked at her then. Really looked. Saw past the Apache dress and dark skin to the woman beneath. A mother in all but blood to these girls. A survivor who kept moving when stopping would be easier. He recognized that too. "Get some rest," he said roughly. "I'll keep watch." Sarah wanted to protest, but exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand. Agnes needed her strong tomorrow. They all did. If you mean us harm, she said quietly, know that I'll fight. For them, I'll fight past dying. I know, Jake said, and he did. It was there in every line of her body, every careful movement. A she-wolf ready to bare teeth for her pack. She moved to the pallet then, curling around her sisters, but she kept the skinning knife close, and her eyes on him until sleep finally claimed her. Jake sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, and watched the snow fall. 4 Apache women in his cabin. If his old sergeant could see him now, if Mary could see him now. But the dead kept their own counsel, and the living had to make choices with what light they had. The fire burned low, and he fed it quietly. The night stretched ahead, full of wind and weather. But for now, this moment, there was warmth and shelter. For now, that was enough. The fire had burned to embers when Sarah woke, knife already in hand before her eyes fully opened. The cabin was still, filled with gray pre-dawn light and the soft breathing of her sisters. Jake sat exactly where she'd last seen him, rifle across his knees, staring into the dying coals. He hadn't moved all night, she realized. Hadn't tried to touch them, hadn't even shifted closer, just kept watch, as he'd promised. You didn't sleep, she said softly, not wanting to wake the others. Used to it, Jake replied without turning. His voice was hoarse with fatigue. Learned in the war, sleep when you're dead. Sarah rose carefully, joints stiff from the floor despite the warmth. Outside, snow still fell in thick curtains, muffling the world in white silence. They were trapped here, for better or worse. She moved to check Agnes, careful to keep distance between herself and Jake. The child's fever had broken in the night, leaving her skin clammy but cool. The whiskey and willow bark had done their work. Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. She'll live, Jake said. He'd been watching without seeming to, seen enough infection to know. She turned the corner. Yes, Sarah agreed. She rewrapped the bandages, noting they'd need changing soon. Her dress had little fabric left to spare. The silence stretched between them. Not quite comfortable, but no longer razor-edged. Sarah found herself studying him in the growing light. Older than she'd first thought. Maybe 35 winters. His brown hair was shot with gray, his face weathered like old leather. The scar on his jaw was a cavalry saber's work. She'd bet she'd seen enough of them. Jake felt her scrutiny, but didn't acknowledge it. He rose stiffly, working feeling back into his legs. I'll get more wood, he said. Start some breakfast. He took the rifle, trust only went so far, and stepped out into the storm. Sarah watched through the window as he waded through knee-deep snow to the woodpile. His movements were efficient, practiced. A man used to solitude, to doing for himself. Mary stirred, whimpering in her sleep. Bad dreams. Sarah knew. They all had them now. Ruth's eyes opened, immediately alert, hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. It's all right, Sarah murmured in Apache. We're safe. For now. The white man? Ruth asked. He kept watch all night, fed us, helped Agnes. Ruth's expression was skeptical. At 16, she'd learned hard lessons about the kindness of white men. Why? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But we'll be careful. Jake returned with an armload of wood, snow cascading from his coat. He rebuilt the fire methodically while Sarah and Ruth roused Mary and helped Agnes sit up. The child was weak but lucid, her eyes clearer than they'd been in days. Breakfast was meager, more jerky. Hardtack soaked in hot water to make a kind of mush. Coffee that was mostly chicory, but it was hot and filling, more than they'd had in a week. Jake ate standing by the window, watching the storm, giving them the table. How long will the snow last? Sarah asked. Day or two, maybe 3, Jake said. This early in the season. Could go either way. Might melt off quick, might be the start of a hard winter. 3 days, Sarah calculated quickly. Their pursuers would lose the trail in this snow, but they'd also be stuck here, dependent on this man's continued goodwill, and their presence put him at risk. Harboring Apaches, even women and children, was enough to get a man hanged in some places. We'll work for our keep, she said. We don't take charity. Jake turned from the window, surprised. No need. There's need, Sarah interrupted. We don't take charity, she repeated firmly. He studied her, this proud woman in her tattered dress. All right, he said finally. Roof needs patching where the snow's getting in. Could use help with that when the storm breaks. Sarah nodded, satisfied. Work was something she understood. Work was clean, honest. It didn't create debts that couldn't be repaid. The day passed slowly. The storm wrapped the cabin in a cocoon of white silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the fire's whisper. Agnes slept fitfully while Mary and Ruth helped Sarah with small tasks, mending Jake's clothes with her precious bone needle, organizing his meager supplies, cleaning. Jake watched them transform his rough bachelor's cabin with bemused interest. He hadn't realized how much dirt and disorder he'd been living in until they began setting it right. Ruth found his tin of lye soap and set to scrubbing the table until it gleamed. Mary discovered rags and attacked the windows, clearing away months of grime. You don't have to, he started. We do, Sarah said simply, not pausing in her sorting of his pantry goods. You have weevils in your flour. He did. Jake peered over her shoulder. Careful not to get too close. Sure enough, the flour was moving. When had that happened? When had he stopped noticing such things? I can sift them out, Sarah continued. Make fresh bread if you have yeast. Bottom shelf, Jake said, then caught himself. When was the last time he'd had fresh bread? Mary used to make it every other day, the cabin filling with its warm scent. He retreated to his chair, unsettled by the memories stirring. These women were temporary, he reminded himself. Soon as the storm broke, they'd move on. Had to. This wasn't their place, and he wasn't their protector. Just a man who couldn't turn away children in a storm. But as the day wore on, the cabin began to feel different, warmer, somehow, and not just from the fire. There was laughter when Mary found his deck of cards and challenged Ruth to a game. There was humming as Sarah worked, some Apache melody he didn't recognize. There was life in these walls again, and it hurt as much as it healed. Evening came early, the storm blotting out the sun. They shared another simple meal, the promised bread, which was better than anything Jake had tasted in years. With the last of his honey, Agnes managed to eat a little, propped up with folded blankets. Tell us a story, Sarah, Mary begged in Apache. Like Mother used to. Sarah glanced at Jake, uncertain. He'd been generous, but would he tolerate their language, their ways, in his home? Go on, he said, understanding the hesitation if not the words. Don't mind me. So Sarah told a story of Coyote and how he stole fire for the people, her voice rising and falling in the old rhythms. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the same one Mary had used reading to Ben, the same one mothers had used since the world began. Ruth and Mary listened with rapt attention, Agnes with drooping eyes. Even Jake found himself drawn in, the unfamiliar syllables washing over him like music. When Sarah finished, the girls begged for another, but she shook her head. Sleep now, she said in English, including Jake in the directive. Tomorrow comes whether we rest or not. As the girls settled for the night, Jake found himself reluctant to resume his vigil in the chair. His back ached, his bad leg throbbed, and exhaustion pulled at him like lead weights. I'll watch tonight, Sarah said quietly. You kept us safe. Now rest. Jake wanted to protest. This was his home, his responsibility, but the offer was too tempting. When had he last slept deeply, without one ear cocked for trouble? Wake me if anything, he started. I will, Sarah promised. She took his place in the chair, knife loose in her lap, eyes on the door. Jake stretched out on the floor near the fire, rifle close at hand. He expected to lie awake, hyper-aware of the strangers in his space. Instead, sleep took him almost instantly, deep and dreamless. Sarah watched him fall into exhausted slumber, noting how the harsh lines of his face softened in sleep. He looked younger, less burdened. She wondered what ghosts rode his shoulders, what losses had driven him to this lonely place. The fire crackled softly. Wind tested the walls, finding no entry. Her sisters breathed evenly, safe for this moment. And somewhere in the storm, their enemies searched fruitlessly for their trail. Sarah had learned not to trust easily. Trust got you killed in this world between worlds. But this man, this strange, scarred white man who kept his distance and his word, him, she thought she might trust, just a little, just for now. The night deepened, and she kept watch, guardian and guarded both. Outside, the snow fell on, covering their tracks, covering the past, leaving only this moment of warmth and unlikely shelter. Morning came clear and bitter cold, the storm having blown itself out in the night. Jake woke to find Sarah still in the chair, but her head had drooped forward in sleep, exhaustion finally claiming her. He rose quietly, joints protesting, and gently took the knife from her slack fingers before it could fall. She startled awake instantly, hand going to where the weapon should be, eyes wild until they focused on him. "Easy," he said softly, stepping back, showing her the knife handle first. "Just didn't want it to drop. Might wake the little ones." Sarah's breathing slowed. She took the knife back, embarrassed to have been caught sleeping on watch. "I'm sorry, You're human," Jake interrupted. "Been there myself more times than I can count." He moved to the window, studying the transformed landscape. Snow lay thick and pristine, erasing all signs of their arrival. The cottonwoods bore their white burden gracefully. Branches bowed but not broken. Ice crystals sparkled in the early sun like scattered diamonds. "Beautiful," Sarah murmured, joining him at the window but maintaining that careful distance they'd established. "Beautiful and deadly." Jake agreed, like most things out here. They stood in companionable silence, watching the world wake. A rabbit ventured from beneath a snow-laden sage, leaving delicate tracks. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, its harsh voice carrying clear in the still air. "I need to check the animals," Jake said finally. "See how they weathered the storm." "I'll help," Sarah offered. When he looked skeptical, she added, "I know horses. Raised them. Before." That word hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Jake nodded, accepting both the help and the boundary. They left Ruth watching over Mary and Agnes, who still slept. Outside, the cold hit like a physical blow, stealing breath and stinging exposed skin. Sarah pulled her thin blanket tighter, but didn't complain. Jake noticed anyway. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the cabin. He returned with an old coat, worn but warm. It's spare. No use letting you freeze." Sarah understood the hesitation. The ghost that had owned this coat before. She took it carefully, respectfully. "Thank you." The coat smelled of cedar and loneliness. It was too big, but the warmth was immediate. She rolled up the sleeves and followed Jake through the knee-deep snow to the lean-to. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, nickered in greeting. A mule occupied the other stall, regarding them with typical mule suspicion. Both animals had weathered the storm well, though ice had formed in their water bucket. "Need to break that up," Jake muttered, looking around for something to use. Sarah was already moving, finding a stick and efficiently breaking the ice. She spoke softly to the animals in Apache, and even the mule seemed to relax at her voice. "You do know horses," Jake observed. "My father was skilled with them," Sarah said carefully. "He taught all his daughters, said we might need the knowledge someday." Her smile was bitter. He was right. They worked together in easy rhythm, mucking stalls, distributing hay, checking hooves for ice buildup. Jake found himself impressed by her competence. No wasted movements, no squeamishness about the dirty work. "Your mount?" he asked, realizing suddenly that they'd arrived on foot. "Sold 2 days ago, for food." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but he heard the loss beneath it. To an Apache, horses were wealth, freedom, survival. To sell them meant true desperation. They finished with the animals and stepped back into the brutal sunshine. The snow hurt to look at, brilliant white stretching endlessly. Jake squinted, judging weather. Might melt some today, he said, but tonight'll freeze hard again. Anyone tracking would have a tough time of it. They won't give up easily. Sarah said, Colonel Harrington, he takes things personally. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew Harrington by reputation, a man who saw all Apaches as vermin to be exterminated. What'd you do to get his personal attention? Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, survived. They started back to the cabin, feet crunching through the snow's crust. Halfway there, Sarah stopped, looking back at their tracks. 2 sets of footprints side by side, momentarily aligned. Your wife, she said suddenly. The coat was hers. It wasn't a question. Jake's throat closed. He managed a nod. She was fortunate, Sarah continued, to have a man who keeps her memory so carefully. Jake wanted to say Mary hadn't been fortunate at all. Dying young, dying hard, dying while he was gone playing soldier. But the words wouldn't come. Inside, they found chaos. Agnes was crying, fever spiking again. Mary tried to soothe her while Ruth searched frantically through their meager possessions. The medicine pouch, Ruth said desperately. I can't find it. It must have fallen. What do you need? Jake asked. Sarah was already at Agnes's side, feeling her forehead. Eagle root, for the fever, and red willow, if... She stopped. White men didn't know these plants, didn't care about Apache medicine. But Jake was thinking. Eagle root, spreading 4 o'clock, pink flowers, grows in the washes. Sarah's eyes widened. You know it? Had an Apache scout once, saved my life with that stuff when I took fever. He was already reaching for his coat. There's a wash about a mile north. Might find some under the snow. The storm, Sarah began. I know this country, Jake said. I'll find it. He was gone before she could protest further. Taking his rifle and a canvas sack, Sarah watched him disappear into the white expanse. This strange man who harbored them, who knew their medicine, who left them alone with his possessions and trust. Will he come back? Mary asked in Apache, voicing what they all wondered. Yes, Sarah said, surprising herself with her certainty. He'll come back. The wait was agony. Agnes's fever climbed despite the willow bark tea. Sarah bathed her with snow-cooled water while Ruth sang the old healing songs, the ones their grandmother had taught them. Mary sat by the window, watching for Jake's return. The sun climbed higher, shadows shortening. Sarah found herself listening for gunshots, for sounds of trouble. A man alone in this snow, searching for medicine for Apache children. There were so many ways it could go wrong. When he finally appeared, Sarah's relief was sharp as a blade. He was moving slowly, favoring his bad leg more than usual, but the sack at his side bulged promisingly. He entered in a rush of cold air, face reddened by wind, ice in his beard. Found it, he said, pulling out not just eagle root but red willow bark and dried sage. The scout. He showed me a few things. Never thought I'd need to remember. Sarah took the plants reverently. These were summer medicines, hard to find even in good weather, that he'd managed in the snow. She prepared the medicine quickly, efficiently, aware of Jake watching her work. This was dangerous, showing him their ways. Knowledge could be weaponized, but Agnes needed this, and he'd already proven himself different from most whites. Your scout, she said as she worked. He was a good teacher. Jose Segundo, Jake said. Chiricahua, better man than most I've served with. Died at Tres Castillos. His voice carried old regret. Sarah's hands stilled. Tres Castillos, where the Mexican army had slaughtered sleeping Apaches, women and children mostly. I'm sorry, she said. He deserved better. They all did, Jake said quietly. The medicine began to work its magic. Agnes's fever broke again, more decisively this time. Color returned to her cheeks, and she asked for water in a clear voice. The relief in the cabin was palpable. Thank you, Sarah said to Jake. The words seemed inadequate for what he'd done, what he'd risked. We can't repay. Didn't ask you to, Jake said gruffly. He settled in his chair, trying to warm his frozen feet. Just couldn't watch another child. He stopped, jaw working. Sarah understood. They were all haunted by children they couldn't save. As afternoon deepened toward evening, a different atmosphere settled over the cabin. The crisis had passed, leaving them all drained but oddly unified. Ruth made dinner from their dwindling supplies, a thin stew that tasted better than it had any right to. Agnes managed to eat a full bowl, to everyone's joy. Tomorrow I'll hunt, Jake announced. Meat's getting low, and you all need better than jerky and hardtack. I can help, Sarah offered. I know how to track, how to clean game. Jake studied her. Most white women would faint at the thought, but she wasn't most women, and he was learning not to underestimate her. All right, he agreed. Ruth can watch the young ones. Ruth nodded solemnly. At 16, she'd been watching children half her life. It was women's work, in both their worlds. As night fell, they settled into what was becoming a routine. The girls by the fire, Jake in his chair, Sarah nearby. But tonight felt different. The desperate edge had softened. They were no longer strangers thrown together by storm and circumstance. They were, what? Not friends. Exactly. But something. People who'd faced trouble together and come through. Tell another story, Mary pleaded. About when the world was young. Sarah glanced at Jake. Do you mind? I could tell it in English. Tell it how it should be told. Jake said, I like the sound, even if I don't understand the words. So Sarah told of first woman and first man, of the emergence into this world, of the holy people who taught the dying how to live. Her voice wove through the cabin like smoke, carrying the weight of generations. Jake listened, watching the firelight play across their faces. 4 Apache women in his cabin, filling it with their language, their stories, their life. If someone had told him a week ago. But that was the thing about this country. It changed you, whether you wanted it or not, made you harder or broke you entirely. And sometimes, rarely, it gave you unexpected gifts, like the sound of an ancient story on a winter night, told by a woman who should be his enemy but wasn't. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, wild voices carrying across the snow. Inside, Sarah's story continued, weaving them all together in its spell. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they were warm and fed and safe. It was enough, more than enough. It was almost like home. Dawn came gray and cold, with the kind of stillness that meant good hunting. Jake had been up for an hour, checking weapons, filling his powder horn, studying the sky. Sarah emerged from the cabin dressed in his spare coat, her feet wrapped in strips of canvas over her worn moccasins. You don't have to come, Jake said, though he was secretly glad for the company. Hunting alone had been necessity for years, but that didn't make it preference. I want to, Sarah replied simply. She carried her skinning knife and had fashioned a carrying sling from rope. Ruth knows what to do. Agnes is stronger today. They set out as the first pale light touched the eastern peaks. The snow had developed a crust that crunched beneath their feet, loud in the morning quiet. Jake led them north, away from the main trail, into country he knew well. Elk come down to the meadows in weather like this, he explained, voice low. Deer too, if we're lucky. Sarah nodded, falling into the hunter's rhythm, eyes scanning, ears alert, movement steady but careful. She noted how he favored his left leg but never complained, how his eyes tracked every shadow and movement, a warrior still, despite his isolation. They walked for an hour, comfortable in shared silence. The land opened up before them, rolling hills dotted with pinyon and juniper, arroyos cutting dark lines through the white. Jake pointed out tracks, rabbit, coyote, the delicate prints of a fox. There, Sarah breathed, touching his arm lightly. Jake followed her gaze. A small herd of mule deer picked their way along a distant ridge. 5 does and a young buck, unaware of the hunters below. "Too far," Jake murmured. "Need to circle around. Come at them from downwind." They moved together, using the terrain for cover. Sarah was impressed by his woodcraft. He might not be Apache, but he'd learned to move like one. They used hand signals when words might carry, a simple language of gesture that needed no translation. The stalk took another hour. The deer were wary, stopping often to test the wind. Twice they spooked at nothing visible, requiring the hunters to freeze until the animals relaxed again. Finally, they were in position. Jake steadied his rifle on a fallen log. Sarah crouched beside him. The buck was broadside now, perhaps 60 yards away, an easy shot for a marksman. "Clean kill," Sarah whispered. It was prayer as much as encouragement. Jake's breathing slowed, between one heartbeat and the next. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack shattered the morning stillness. The buck leaped once, then crumpled. The does scattered, white tails flashing as they bounded away. "Good shot," Sarah said with genuine admiration. They approached the fallen deer carefully, respectfully. Sarah surprised Jake by kneeling beside the animal, placing her hand on its still warm flank, murmuring words in Apache, thanking his spirit. She explained at Jake's questioning look, "For giving his life so we might live." Jake had seen Jose Segundo do something similar. It seemed right, proper, more respectful than the casual slaughter he'd witnessed in his army days. They worked together to field dress the deer. Sarah's knife worked quick and efficient. Jake noticed she saved organs most whites would discard. Heart, liver, kidneys. Nothing wasted. They packed the meat in snow and canvas, fashioning a travois from saplings to drag it back. "Heavy load," Jake said, eyeing the distance they'd covered. "We'll manage." Sarah replied. She took one pole of the travois without being asked, matching his pace as they began the long trek back. The sun climbed higher, warming the day slightly. They stopped once to rest, sharing water from Jake's canteen, backs against a sun-warmed boulder. "You hunt often with your husband?" Jake asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Sarah didn't seem offended. "Sometimes he preferred raiding to hunting, said it was easier to take cattle than track deer." Her smile was sad. "It killed him in the end, rancher's bullet." "I'm sorry," Jake said, meaning it. "He died as he lived." Sarah said, "I mourned him, but I won't lie and say he was perfect. He left me with 3 sisters to raise and enemies on all sides." Jake understood that kind of brutal honesty. "My Mary died while I was off fighting Apaches," he said suddenly. "Cholera took her and our boy. I wasn't there. Still don't know if that makes it better or worse." "Worse," Sarah said quietly. "To not be there is worse. Trust me in this." They resumed their journey, the travois leaving deep grooves in the snow. The shared confessions had shifted something between them, removed a barrier neither had fully acknowledged. As they neared the cabin, Jake stiffened. Fresh tracks crossed their path. Horses, several of them, moving fast despite the snow. "When?" Sarah asked, reading the signs as quickly as he did. "This morning, maybe 2 hours ago." Jake's hand went to his rifle. They passed within 100 yards of the cabin. Fear clawed at Sarah's throat. If the riders had found her sisters, they increased their pace, abandoning caution for speed. The cabin came into view, intact, smoke still rising from the chimney. No horses in sight. Ruth appeared in the doorway, knife in hand, relaxing when she saw them. "Riders came," she reported in rapid Apache. 5 men. They circled but didn't approach. I kept everyone quiet and hidden." "Smart girl," Jake said, understanding the tone if not the words. He studied the tracks more carefully. "Looks like they kept moving south. Maybe didn't see the cabin for the trees. Or maybe they were tracking something else." "Or someone else," Sarah said grimly. There were other Apache bands fleeing the reservation, other families seeking escape. "We brought danger to you. Danger was here before you came." Jake said, "Always is, in this country." They hauled the deer inside, where Mary and Agnes greeted them with excitement. Fresh meat was cause for celebration after days of meager rations. Sarah set about butchering the deer properly while Jake kept watch, rifle near the window. "We should smoke some," Sarah suggested. "Preserve it. The weather might turn again." Jake showed her to his small smokehouse out back, really just a converted shed. Together they prepared the meat, Sarah demonstrating how to cut it thin for better preservation, Jake providing the oak and mesquite wood that would give it flavor. As they worked, Agnes limped out to watch, leaning heavily on Ruth. The child was recovering but still weak. She said something in Apache that made Sarah smile. "What'd she say?" Jake asked. "She says you hunt like her grandfather did, patient and respectful." Sarah's eyes were warm. "That's high praise from her." They spent the afternoon tending the smokehouse, the rich scent of curing meat filling the air. It was work Jake had done alone for years, but having company made it lighter somehow. Sarah showed him Apache methods for using every part of the deer: sinew for thread, hide for leather, bones for tools. "Your people waste nothing," Jake observed. "Waste is luxury we never had." Sarah replied, "Everything has purpose. Everything has value." As evening approached, they prepared a feast by their modest standards: fresh venison steaks, pan bread Sarah made from the last of the clean flour, wild onions Jake had stored from autumn gathering, the cabin filled with warmth and cooking smells, comfortable sounds of family life. But underneath the domestic peace, tension hummed. Those riders would be back, or others like them. The snow was melting slowly. Soon travel would be easier. Decisions would have to be made. After dinner, as the girls played quietly with Jake's cards, Sarah joined him by the window. They stood side by side, watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. "We'll need to leave soon," she said softly. "When Agnes is stronger, you've risked enough for us." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Where will you go?" "Mexico, maybe, or deeper into the mountains. Somewhere they won't follow. That's no life for children. Neither is dying." Her voice was matter-of-fact. "We're Apache. We endure." Jake wanted to protest, to offer. What? He couldn't protect them forever, couldn't make the world accept what it was determined to destroy. But the thought of them leaving, of the cabin returning to its former silence. "Not yet," he said finally. "Agnes needs more time, and the meat needs to cure properly. A few more days." Sarah looked at him, seeing through the practical excuses to something deeper. "A few more days," she agreed. They stood together as darkness fell, neither speaking of what those days might bring or what would come after. The moment was fragile as spring ice, precious because of its impermanence. Inside, Mary was laughing at something Ruth had said. Agnes was humming, almost healthy again. Normal sounds, family sounds, in a place that had known too much silence. Jake found himself memorizing it all, the way Sarah's profile looked against the fading light, the sound of Apache words mixing with English, the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat, building memories for the empty years ahead. Beside him, Sarah was doing the same, storing up the feeling of safety, of shelter, of standing beside someone who didn't see her as enemy or savage, but simply as herself. It wouldn't last. Nothing good ever did. But for now, for these few stolen days, it was theirs. The first stars appeared, cold and distant in the winter sky. Inside, the fire crackled and the children played. Outside, the vast darkness of the frontier pressed close, full of danger and possibility both. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, they were together. Tonight, that was enough. The news came with the dawn 2 days later. Jake had ridden to the nearest trading post for supplies, leaving Sarah armed with his spare rifle and strict instructions to bar the door. He returned with a grim expression and a week-old newspaper. "Harrington's put a bounty out," he said without preamble. $20 a head for Apache women and children brought in alive. 50 for warriors, dead or alive. Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. One of Jake's, worn thin at the elbows. $20, she repeated softly. That's what our lives are worth. To him, Jake said fiercely. Not to... He stopped, but they both heard the unfinished words. Ruth had been listening from across the room. Her English had improved remarkably in their days here. Men will come. $20 is much money. Too much, Sarah agreed. She set aside the mending, mind already calculating. We've stayed too long, brought danger to your door. That's not... Jake began. Please. Sarah's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. Don't make this harder. You know we must go. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching clouds race across the moon, thinking of empty years stretching ahead. In the morning, they would leave. It was right, necessary. So why did it feel like another death? A soft footstep made him turn. Sarah stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders, in the moonlight. She looked younger, vulnerable in a way daylight never showed. Can't sleep either, she said. No. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the sage smoke in her hair. For a long moment, they just stood there, watching the night. In another world, Sarah said softly, things might be different. In another world, we might never have met. That would be worse, I think. Jake turned to look at her, finding her eyes already on him. The space between them hummed with possibility, with all the words they couldn't say. Sarah, his voice was rough. She placed her fingers gently over his lips. I know, but we have tonight. Can that be enough? He caught her hand, held it. It has to be. The next morning brought unwelcome confirmation of their fears. Mary, posted as lookout, spotted dust clouds to the south. Riders, many of them, moving with purpose. How long? Jake asked. By noon, maybe sooner. Sarah judged. She was already gathering their few possessions, movements quick and efficient. Ruth, help Agnes. Mary, pack the food. Jake saddled his horse and the mule, his mind racing. The riders would follow the easiest path, up the main valley. But there was another way, harder and more dangerous. Through the high passes. I'm going with you, he announced. Sarah paused in her packing. Jake, no, this isn't your fight. Isn't it? He checked his rifle, began filling cartridge boxes. I made my choice when I opened that door. I'm not backing out now. They'll brand you a traitor, Indian lover. You'll never be able to come back here. Then I'll find somewhere else. His jaw was set, stubborn. I'm not letting you face them alone. Sarah wanted to protest further, but time was running short, and truthfully, she was grateful. The high passes would be treacherous, especially with Agnes still weak. An extra gun, someone who knew the country. Thank you, she said simply. They loaded quickly, Jake insisting the girls ride while he and Sarah walked. The cabin looked small and forlorn as they left it, smoke still rising from the chimney like a beacon for their pursuers. I'm sorry about your home, Sarah said. It was just walls and a roof. Jake replied, but his last look back said otherwise. They climbed hard and fast, following game trails up the mountainside. Jake led them through paths Sarah wouldn't have found alone, places where horses had to be led single file, where one misstep meant a long fall. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they were high above the valley. Jake called a brief halt, pulling out his field glasses to study their back trail. There, he said, handing the glasses to Sarah. She saw them clearly, a dozen riders, maybe more, surrounding the cabin. Even from this distance, she could see the uniform of Colonel Harrington, the way he sat his horse like a man who owned the world. They'll search the cabin, find our trail, she said. Let them. By the time they figure out which way we went, we'll be over the pass. They pushed on, the air growing thinner, colder. Agnes rode in front of Jake, his arm steady around her when the trail grew rough. Mary and Ruth followed on the mule, Sarah bringing up the rear, watching for pursuit. The pass itself was a narrow notch between two peaks, barely wide enough for a horse. Wind howled through it, driving ice crystals that stung exposed skin. They dismounted, leading the animals carefully across patches of ice and loose stone. "Almost there," Jake encouraged Agnes, who was shivering despite being wrapped in his coat. "Just a little farther. Brave girl." They were halfway through when they heard it, the crack of a rifle, echoing off the canyon walls. A puff of rock dust exploded near Jake's head. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Agnes behind a boulder. Another shot whined off the rocks, then another. Sarah scrambled for cover, trying to spot the shooter. There, a lone rider on the trail below. Advance scout for the main party. He was reloading, taking careful aim. Jake's rifle spoke first. The scout tumbled from his saddle, his horse bolting back down the trail. But the damage was done. The shots would bring the others running. "Move!" Jake ordered. "Fast as we can." They ran, slipping and sliding on the treacherous ground. Behind them, shouts echoed up the mountain. More riders appeared on the trail below, spurring their horses hard. The far side of the pass opened onto a steep slope covered in loose shale. Jake went first, half sliding, half running, carrying Agnes. The others followed, small avalanches of stone cascading around them, rifles cracked behind them, bullets singing off the rocks. Ruth cried out, clutching her arm where stone shrapnel had cut her. Sarah grabbed her, keeping her moving. At the bottom of the slope, thick forest offered cover. They plunged into it, branches tearing at clothes and skin. Jake led them in a twisting path, using every trick he'd learned in 3 years of frontier warfare. Behind them, the pursuit faltered. Horses couldn't follow through the dense undergrowth. Men on foot crashed through the forest. But Jake knew this country, and they didn't. They ran until their lungs burned, until Agnes whimpered with each jolting step. Finally, Jake called a halt in a dense thicket of pine, everyone gasping for breath. "Let me see," Sarah said to Ruth, examining her arm. The cut was shallow, but bleeding freely. She bound it quickly with strips torn from her underskirt. "They'll keep coming," Ruth said, voice steady despite her pallor. "Not through here," Jake said. "Not with night falling. They'll have to go around, take the long way. Gives us time." "For what?" Mary asked. Jake looked at Sarah. "There's a place, old mining camp, abandoned for years. Defensible. We could hole up there, wait them out. Or be trapped," Sarah pointed out. "Maybe, but Agnes can't keep running. None of us can. Not like this." It was true. They were exhausted, wounded, running on fear and adrenaline. Sarah weighed their options, finding them all bad. "How far?" she asked. 2 hours, maybe 3 in the dark. "Then we go." They moved more slowly now, carefully. Jake broke trail while Sarah swept their back trail, watching for pursuit. The forest grew darker, full of shadows and small sounds that might be wind or might be hunters. Agnes dozed fitfully in Jake's arms, fever returning. Ruth and Mary stumbled along, holding each other up. Only Sarah seemed tireless, driven by the fierce need to protect her sisters. The mining camp appeared like a ghost town in the moonlight, a handful of buildings clinging to a hillside, empty windows staring like dead eyes. Jake led them to the most intact structure, a stone building that might have been an assay office. "Home, sweet home," he muttered, kicking open the door. Inside was dust and darkness, but also solid walls and a roof. They made the girls as comfortable as possible while Jake barricaded the door and checked sight lines from the windows. "They'll find us," Sarah said quietly. "Probably, but not tonight, and these walls will stop bullets better than forest." She nodded, understanding. They'd traded running room for a defensive position. It might buy time, nothing more. As if reading her thoughts. Jake said, "I'll hold them here. You take the girls out the back, keep heading north. There's a town called Cedar Falls, about 20 miles. Sheriff there is a fair man. He'll—" "No! Sarah! No!" Her voice was steel. "We stand together or not at all." He looked at her for a long moment. this remarkable woman who'd walked into his life with a blizzard and changed everything. Together, then, outside, a coyote howled, answered by another, or maybe not coyotes at all. The night pressed close, full of threat and promise both. Sarah checked on her sisters, all asleep now despite the danger. Then she joined Jake at the window, rifle in hand, watching the darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she began. "I know," he said. "No regrets." They stood guard together through the long night, waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. The old mining camp held its silence, keeping their secrets for one more night. Dawn came with fire and thunder. Sarah woke to Jake shaking her shoulder, his face grim in the gray light. "They're here," he said simply. She was on her feet instantly, rifle in hand. Through the window, she could see them, riders spread in a semicircle around the building, more arriving from the forest. Harrington sat his horse in the center, patient as a spider. 20 men, maybe more. Jake assessed. "They've got us surrounded." Ruth and Mary were awake now, clutching each other. Agnes stirred weakly, still fevered despite Sarah's herbs. "What do we do?" Mary whispered. Before anyone could answer, Harrington's voice boomed across the morning air. "Jake Thornton, I know you're in there. Come out with those Apache women, and we might let you live." Jake snorted. "Might, that's generous of him. You've got 1 minute to decide." Harrington continued. "Then we burn you out." Sarah touched Jake's arm. "You could still—" "Don't!" His voice was sharp. "Don't even think it." They took positions at the windows, weapons ready. The stone walls would protect them for a while, but against so many. "Thornton," Harrington called again. "I've got no quarrel with you. You were a good soldier once. Don't die for a bunch of savages." Jake's response was a rifle shot that knocked Harrington's hat into the dust. The colonel dove from his horse as all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets chipping stone and splintering wood. Jake and Sarah returned fire methodically, making each shot count. Ruth reloaded for them while Mary shielded Agnes with her body. The initial assault lasted 10 minutes that felt like hours. When the firing slackened, 2 of Harrington's men lay still in the dust. The others had pulled back to better cover. "Nice shooting," Jake commented, noting one of the fallen wore sergeant's stripes. "You took Mason. He was their best marksman." "Learned from necessity," Sarah replied, already reloading. A strange quiet fell. Then smoke began seeping under the door. Harrington's men had set fire to the wooden lean-to attached to their shelter. "Trying to smoke us out," Jake muttered. He kicked at the connecting door, trying to block the smoke, but it found every crack. Agnes began coughing, her weakened lungs struggling. Mary tried to cover her face with cloth, but the smoke grew thicker. "We can't stay here," Sarah said. Jake knew she was right. The stone building wouldn't burn, but they'd suffocate long before the fire died. He studied their options, finding them all bad. "There's an old mine shaft out back," he said. "Connects to another exit up the hillside. If we can reach it, they'll be watching for us to run. Not all of them. Not if we give them something else to think about." Jake explained quickly. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but better than dying like trapped animals. Sarah gathered her sisters while Jake prepared. When he gave the signal, she threw open the back door and ran, half carrying Agnes, Ruth and Mary close behind. Jake burst from the front, firing rapidly, drawing attention and returned fire. He sprinted for a pile of mining equipment, dove behind it as bullets whined past. Sarah reached the mine entrance, a black mouth in the hillside. No time to hesitate. She plunged in, feeling her way in sudden darkness. Behind her, Ruth gasped at the closeness, the weight of mountain above them. "Keep moving," Sarah urged. "Stay close." The shaft was narrow, low. They felt their way forward, hands on rough stone walls. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The air was stale, hard to breathe after the smoke. Outside, Jake kept up his diversion, moving between cover. making them think he was trying to flank them. He'd bought Sarah maybe 5 minutes. He hoped it was enough. A bullet caught him in the shoulder. Spinning him around, he stumbled, fired back one-handed, kept moving. Blood soaked his shirt, but he'd had worse. In the mine. Sarah found the branching Jake had described. The left shaft. He'd said it should open onto the hillside above the camp. Should. If it hadn't collapsed. If he remembered right. If. Light ahead. Blessed daylight filtering through boards covering another entrance. Sarah shoved against them. Once. Twice. They gave way with a crack, and she tumbled out onto a steep slope covered with mine tailings. Quickly, she hissed, pulling her sisters out. They could hear the gunfire below, see smoke rising from the burning building. Then she saw Jake fall. He'd almost made it to the mine entrance when Harrington himself stepped from cover, pistol aimed. The shot took Jake in the bad leg, dropping him to his knees. "No!" The word tore from Sarah's throat. She was running before thought could stop her. Sliding down the loose slope, Ruth tried to grab her, missed. Sarah hit the level ground running, knife in one hand, Jake's spare pistol in the other. Harrington was walking toward Jake, savoring his victory. He didn't see her coming until too late. The knife caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. His shot went wide. Sarah put herself between Jake and danger. Pistol raised. Around them, Harrington's men shouted, weapons swinging toward her. Time seemed to stop. "Nobody move!" A new voice cracked across the camp. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons!" Men on horseback poured from the forest. A full squad of cavalry led by a man with a marshal's star. Harrington's men hesitated, confused. "I said drop them," the marshal repeated. "Colonel Harrington, you're under arrest for exceeding your authority and organizing an illegal militia." "These are escaped hostiles," Harrington protested, clutching his wounded shoulder. "There's a bounty." "Not anymore." The marshal dismounted. A lean man with eyes like winter. "New orders from Washington. All pursuit of peaceful Apache refugees is to cease immediately. Some treaty the president's working on." Jake laughed. Or tried to. It came out as a cough. "Your timing is appreciated. Marshal." "Gibson. And you'd be Jake Thornton." "Your friend Jose Segundo's widow sent word you might need help. Took me a while to find you." Sarah was trying to stop the bleeding from Jake's leg, hands red with his blood. "He needs a doctor." "There's one in Cedar Falls," Gibson said. "We'll get him there." He looked at Harrington's men, some of whom were edging toward their horses. "Anyone moves before I say, they'll be shot. That's a promise." The next hour passed in a blur. Jake drifting in and out of consciousness. Sarah refusing to leave his side. Her sisters huddled together, watching the soldiers with a mix of fear and hope. They made a travois for Jake, Sarah walking beside it, one hand on his chest to feel his breathing. He woke once, caught her hand. "The girls," he mumbled. "Safe. We're all safe." "Good. That's good." The ride to Cedar Falls took forever and no time at all. The doctor was skilled, digging out bullets with practiced ease. "He'll live," he pronounced. "Leg's going to be stiff, but he'll walk." Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. Ruth caught her, held her up. They were given rooms at the boarding house, charity from the marshal, who seemed amused by the whole situation. "Jose Segundo's widow," Sarah said to Gibson later. "I didn't know. Maria's living on the reservation now, but she remembered Jake's kindness to her husband, asked me to keep an ear out. Good woman." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "They all are." 3 days later, Jake woke clear-headed to find Sarah beside his bed, mending one of his shirts. Again. "You're here," he said, wonder in his voice. "Where else would I be?" "Anywhere. Mexico. The mountains. Away from all this." Sarah set down her sewing, met his eyes. "I thought about it. We could run, keep running, maybe find peace somewhere." She paused. "Or we could stay, make a stand, together." "Sarah," he reached for her hand. "It won't be easy. People will talk. Some will do worse than talk. I know. She squeezed his fingers. But Agnes needs schooling. The girls need a chance at a real life. And I'm tired of running. The cabin's gone. Harrington's men burned it. Then we'll build another. Better, stronger. Her smile was fierce and beautiful. I'm Apache, Jake. We know how to endure, but maybe it's time to do more than endure. Jake pulled her down, kissed her forehead. Together, then. Together. Outside the window, Cedar Falls went about its business. Some folks stared at the Apache women in town. Others nodded politely. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing. Marshal Gibson stopped by before leaving. Harrington's been relieved of command. Court-martial likely. You two planning to stay in the area? Thinking about it. Jake said, Good. Country needs more folks willing to stand for what's right. He tipped his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, you need anything. You send word. That evening, they gathered in Jake's room, all 5 of them. A makeshift family born of storm and struggle. Agnes was fully recovered, chattering about the town's school. Ruth and Mary were learning to navigate this new world, cautious but hopeful. Tell us a story. Sarah, Agnes begged. About Coyote. A new one, Mary added. About how Coyote found a new home. Sarah smiled, gathering them close. Jake's hand found hers, warm and steady. Very well, she said. This is the story of how Coyote stopped running and learned to build. Her voice rose and fell in the old rhythms, weaving a new story from ancient patterns. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and hope. Tomorrow would bring challenges. But tonight, they were together, safe, home. The cabin was gone, but what they'd built in its place was stronger than any walls. A future, a family, a chance for something better. In this land of harsh beauty and harsher realities, it was more than enough. It was everything. Spring came to the high country like a tentative promise, melting snow revealing green shoots of new grass. Jake stood on the rise overlooking their valley. Leaning on the walking stick Sarah had carved for him, his leg would never be quite right. But he could walk, could work, could build. That was enough. Below, their new cabin took shape, larger than the old one, with real glass windows and a proper floor. The whole town had pitched in, some out of curiosity, others from genuine goodwill. Even those who muttered about Indian lovers had to admit Jake Thornton had earned respect through his years of honest trading. It's beautiful, Sarah said. Joining him, she wore a new dress, store-bought calico, though she'd added traditional Apache beadwork at the collar and cuffs. A compromise, like so many things in their life now. Getting there, Jake agreed, slipping his arm around her waist. They'd been married 3 months now. A simple ceremony with Marshal Gibson standing witness. Not everyone approved, but the law was the law, and the certificate hanging on their wall said what they were to each other in terms even the stubborn could understand. Agnes ran past, chasing a butterfly, her laughter bright as bird song. School had been good for her. She devoured books like a starving person devours bread, already talking about becoming a teacher herself someday. Miss Patterson says I have the best penmanship in class, she'd announced proudly just yesterday. The same Miss Patterson who'd initially resisted having an Apache child in her classroom now used Agnes as an example to the others. Ruth emerged from the cabin, flower in her hair. At 17, she'd bloomed into a striking young woman who drew looks from the young men in town, much to Jake's protective displeasure and Sarah's amusement. Bread's in the oven, Ruth called. Mary's watching it. Mary, quiet Mary, had found her voice in unexpected ways. She'd taken to helping Doc Morrison with his rounds, showing a natural gift for healing that impressed even that gruff old veteran. Girls got steady hands and a steadier heart. He'd said, I'd train her proper if things were different. But things were becoming different, slowly. The world was changing, one heart at a time. Riders coming, Jake noted, squinting at the dust cloud approaching from town. Sarah tensed automatically, old habits dying hard, but Jake was relaxed, even smiling. "That'll be Tom Bradley. Said he'd bring out those fruit trees I ordered." Tom Bradley, who'd lost a son to Apache raiders 5 years back, now bringing trees to plant in Jake Thornton's Apache wife's garden. If that wasn't proof of change, nothing was. The trees were young apples and pears, their roots wrapped in burlap. Tom helped Jake plant them while Sarah and his wife Emma shared coffee and careful conversation. Small steps, but steps forward. That evening, they gathered for dinner around the big table Jake had built. Another compromise between Apache floor sitting and American chair sitting. The girls chattered about their day while Sarah served the traditional meal she'd prepared. Venison stew with wild herbs. Fry bread. Beans seasoned with chilies. "I still say you should open a restaurant," Jake teased. "Make a fortune feeding hungry cowboys. And have them all falling in love with her cooking," Ruth added with a grin. "You'd be fighting off suitors with a stick." "I've got a stick," Jake said, gesturing to his walking stick. "And I know how to use it." The laughter that followed was easy. Natural, family laughter. It still surprised Sarah sometimes, how naturally they'd grown together. How completely Jake had accepted not just her but her sisters as his own. After dinner, as was their custom, they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson. The girls worked on their projects, Agnes reading, Ruth sewing, Mary studying the medical text Doc Morrison had lent her. "We've come far," Sarah said softly to Jake. "Distance isn't always measured in miles," he replied. She knew he was thinking of all the distances they'd crossed, from enemy to friend, from stranger to family, from distrust to love. The physical journey from that snowbound night to this spring evening was nothing compared to the journey of their hearts. "Any regrets?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Jake pulled her closer. "Only that it took a blizzard and near death to bring us together. Could have saved some time if I'd been smarter." "The journey makes the destination sweeter," Sarah said, quoting one of her grandmother's sayings. A hawk circled overhead, riding the evening thermals. In the garden, the newly planted trees stood straight despite the breeze, their roots already reaching deep into soil that would nourish them for generations to come. "Sarah," Agnes called, "will you tell the story again? About the night we came to Jake's cabin?" It had become their favorite. How fear became trust. How strangers became family. How a bitter winter night led to this gentle spring evening. "Very well," Sarah said, settling back. "But Jake tells part of it now, too. It's his story as much as ours." So they told it together, Jake's deep voice alternating with Sarah's melodious one. How the snow had fallen. How the door had opened. How those first careful words, "All 4 of you, come in," had changed everything. The girls never tired of hearing it. Especially the parts they'd been too young or too frightened to fully understand at the time. How Jake had kept watch all night. How Sarah had memorized every exit while trusting enough to sleep. How each small act of kindness had built a bridge between worlds. "And now?" Agnes asked when they reached the end, though she knew this part too. "And now," Jake said, "we're home. All of us," Sarah added, gathering her sisters close with her eyes. "All of us are home." The stars came out one by one. Familiar constellations that had watched over Apache and settler alike for countless generations. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth, not for warmth on this mild evening, but for the comfort of its light, the memory of that first night, the promise of all the nights to come. Tom Bradley had mentioned more families moving into the valley. Good people, he'd said. People who judged a person by their actions, not their blood. The school was expanding. Doc Morrison had finally agreed to formally train Mary. Precedent be damned. Ruth had caught the eye of the minister's son, a kind young man who saw her grace, not her race. Changes. All changes. Some would be hard. There would be those who never accepted them, who saw Sarah's brown skin and Apache features as a threat to their world. But there would be others too, like Emma Bradley, who'd shyly asked Sarah to teach her beadwork, like Miss Patterson, who'd recommended Agnes for the territorial spelling bee, like Marshall Gibson, who'd made it clear that the law protected all families, regardless of their makeup. "Time for bed," Sarah announced as the moon rose full and bright. The girls groaned but obeyed, each pausing to kiss Jake goodnight, a gesture that still made his eyes suspiciously bright. He'd never expected to be a father again, and never thought his heart could expand to hold so much love. Later, as Sarah and Jake lay together in their room, listening to the night sounds through the open window, she traced the scars on his chest, old wounds from old battles. "We're like this land," she murmured, scarred but strong, tested by fire and storm but still standing. "Still growing," Jake corrected, thinking of those young fruit trees, their roots reaching deep, getting stronger every season. Outside, a coyote called from the ridgeline, answered by another across the valley. Wild voices in a land that would never be fully tamed, only shared, like their love, part Apache tradition, part American future, wholly their own. Sarah smiled in the darkness, remembering her grandmother's words. "The strongest basket is woven from different materials." They were that basket, Apache willow and American oak, bent and shaped by circumstance, made beautiful by their joining. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. There would be storms to weather, literal and figurative, but they would face them as they'd learned to face everything, together. 5 people who'd found each other in a blizzard, who'd chosen love over fear, family over solitude. In the garden, the fruit trees stood sentinel, their leaves whispering promises of harvests to come. On the porch, Jake's walking stick leaned against Sarah's loom. Tools of survival become symbols of home. And in the cabin, 5 hearts beat in rhythm with the vast, wild country that had brought them together. The moon climbed higher, bathing the valley in silver light. Somewhere, an owl hooted. The night deepened, peaceful and full of promise. In this land of harsh beauty and endless sky, they'd carved out their own small paradise, not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every struggle. Sarah's hand found Jake's in the darkness, fingers intertwining like their lives, separate strands woven into something stronger, more beautiful than either could be alone. He squeezed gently, a wordless promise of all the tomorrows they'd share. Sleep took them gently, wrapped in warmth and love and the quiet satisfaction of a life well built. Outside, the stars wheeled on, eternal witnesses to the small miracles that bloom when hearts open wide enough to hold the whole wild world. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival in the Wild West. I hope it touched your heart as it did mine. Please share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know where in the world these tales of the American frontier are reaching. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let me know your thoughts about Sarah and Jake's journey. What part of their story resonated most with you? Until next time, partners.